Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel and Chaos podcast, promoting mindful communication growth through conflict. So today I want to look at the topic of how to resolve allegations of bullying in the workplace. Now, some of you may know that I wrote a book on this, brought it out about 4 or 5 years ago. And what it details is the experiences that I've had of seeing allegations of bullying being resolved through the practices of mediation and conflict coaching, and and to make the distinction between those processes and the traditional approaches to bullying allegations, which is what I call the prove and punish approach, or the expectation of the possibility of a prove and punish approach is perhaps a more accurate way of describing things, because there does seem to be, despite almost never there being an outcome that fulfills this, an expectation that when an allegation of bullying is made, that it be proven and then people be punished for it. And as I say, and you will have seen in other videos I've done about allegations of workplace bullying, that is almost never the case. It almost never succeeds, and yet it is still the approach used in almost all organisations globally. To be honest, you can look at organisations in the USA, in Australia, as well as in the UK, where there's this approach which suggests that you can take an approach which seeks to prove that bullying has occurred and then punish the people involved. And I personally don't know of any situation where that's actually effectively been processed. And what a lot of people will resort to if they feel they've been bullied is to say that that's all because it's a whitewash and a cover-up and a conspiracy, etc., rather than acknowledge that it's simply the process itself which is fundamentally flawed and can never work. So, sometimes people say you need training and things like that to mean that people use the process more effectively. The process itself is fundamentally flawed and cannot work. Now, obviously, I want to make a distinction, as I do here and again I have in other videos, between bullying and harassment. Now, harassment is a legally defined discriminatory practice. So what I'm talking about today is not harassment, it's about bullying. And one of the major issues that exists is this conflation of the two, as if they're pretty much the same, and they really are not. So I won't go into detail on that here because I want to talk about bullying today, but it really is important that there's a clarity of the distinction between the two, because it changes everything about things, how things are approached. Now, in the book that I wrote, I'll put an image up just so you can see it if you haven't seen it already. The approach I'm taking is to look at the perspective from all kind of angles involved. So from the perspective of the person who feels bullied and has made an allegation, or may not have yet but is considering it, the person who's accused of bullying, or people. In all these cases it could be one or it could be more than one. But also for the people tasked with the usual approach of investigating and proving that bullying has occurred, and the fact that from all those perspectives the prove and punish approach just cannot work. I mean, it doesn't work and it cannot work. And what it inevitably leads to is what I describe as a circle of blame. So everybody's blaming everybody else for why it doesn't work, which obviously doesn't help things at all. It doesn't help any kind of resolution. It just makes things worse, and it becomes inconclusive, and it means that things fester, and it means the stress increases, and almost always it leads to one or more of the people involved leaving the place of work where it's happened. But just to emphasize that the reason that happens is almost always not because of the bullying allegation or experience or felt experience itself. It's not really anything to do with the other person. It's to do with the way the organization has responded. So in most situations where someone leaves a place of work as a consequence of these processes, it's more often because of a claim of constructive dismissal, because the tendency is, well, let's go through the process and I'll explain why, actually, that often when a bullying allegation is made, the people involved are then kept separate, because it then immediately, without consideration of other options, moves into an adversarial approach of proving or disproving that bullying has occurred. And so the people involved tend to be kept apart because of that process. And also sometimes for managers, they say, well, we don't want people having arguments in the workplace, so we'll keep them separate. So what that then means is that they're one or both, and it happens to the people accused of bullying as well quite often, one or both are moved to jobs which are not the jobs they're employed for, but they're moved to them simply because it's felt to be a way of dealing with the problem. And in many cases, it's hoped that actually just makes the problem go away, which obviously it's not going to, because the people involved, again, whether it's just one or both, are moved to different roles. They're now not doing the job that they expected. So that's what often then leads to a constructive dismissal claim, because often they're moved to jobs which are not going to be more demanding of them. They're going to be less demanding. They can be quite unchallenging jobs in terms of the level at which the person has been employed. So that's what often then leads to leaving. But there's also the stress of being involved in the situation and it not feeling as though it's being resolved. So this is why, or one of them, no, there's more to it. Let me go into more about why it doesn't work. What then happens is there's an attempt to assess whether there has been bullying or not, based on an entirely subjective description of what bullying is. And I say that because, well, first of all, there's no legal definition of bullying. So there isn't an accepted description of what it is. There might be some organisations, such as in the UK, ACAS has its own characterisation of bullying. But there are countless others. If you go online, you can find countless different descriptions of what bullying is. And of course, when there are so many, anybody can find a behaviour that they think they see in another person that can be described as bullying. And again, I talk about all this in the book and just give some examples of behaviours that actually are just normal everyday behaviours, which perceived from a certain angle can look like they're negative. But it's things like, I've seen things like people giving a monosyllabic answer to the question, how are you? And that's included in a list of behaviours that apparently constitute bullying. Well, sometimes people might say to me, how are you today? I might say, fine. Does that mean I'm a bully? And I know some people might say that's trivialising it. And of course, just that one example is. But if you add lots of different ones together and say, oh, there's 6 different things that the person's doing there, and they're all that small, but you add them up together, it becomes a justification to say, yes, look, this person is bullying me. And it just doesn't work. The point is, for the person who feels they're experiencing it, they may believe it's bullying, but they're not going to be able to convince anyone that it is, because there's always a different interpretation of that kind of behaviour. So my aim is, and I'll come on to how I see mediation and conflict coaching and things that can be learned from that can help. The consequence of that is that that people who allege bullying can feel like they've experienced it, but no one believes them. And it's what I've described elsewhere as being, it's almost like a ghost. People might say, oh, I've seen a ghost, but they can't prove to anyone that they've seen it. And it's exactly that same kind of experience that people have. They say, I've experienced bullying, and they say, well, prove it. And it's so hard to do so. There's so much more I could say on this, but I'm going to keep moving on. But just to emphasise how difficult that is to come to any objective belief or proof that there has been bullying. And also, obviously, on the other side, the person accused of bullying is going to say, well, that wasn't bullying, that was just me doing my job of managing you or working alongside you, depending on the nature of their relationship. And then you've got the third person who's tasked with trying to come to an objective assessment of it. And hopefully you're starting to see why, even though people might want it to be the process that helps them, it can't. It can't help them, because this idea that what you've got to do is prove that bullying exists by default means that if you don't manage to prove that bullying exists, then there's nothing that can change. You either prove there is a bully or you don't. And if you don't, it's as if nothing changes and everything carries on. And the failure of that is, it means that people feel incredibly let down, because when there isn't a conclusive outcome, the person who feels they've been bullied feels let down and unsupported. But also the person accused of bullying feels let down and unsupported, because it means they've got this kind of dark cloud hanging over them. So no one is happy as an outcome. No, or happy may not be the right word, but no one is able to move forward effectively as an outcome. Let's put it that way. And also, obviously, both people then start to blame the investigators for either not endorsing their view or not clearing their name, as they might see it. And beyond that, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to stay like that. So you can see how, as well as any constructive dismissal claims, there's also going to be the stress and the discomfort of that environment, simply because there wasn't a clear conclusion. Now, the reason I say that mediation and conflict coaching can be so useful, but it doesn't even have to be those things. There can be other approaches that people take that can be more constructive and more self-supporting in the situation. And the reason I say self-supporting is that quite often what people are looking to in those situations is an outside body to do the sorting out of the problem for them. And if they have a dependency on that and think, well, there's nothing I can do, I've got to hand this over to my manager to sort out, then they're placing themselves in a very dependent and very fragile and anxiety-causing situation. Because it's like saying, well, if it's only going to be if the manager sort this out, or it's only going to be if my manager or my colleague who I feel is bullying me changes, that I can be any better off in this situation. As if there's nothing I can do. It's got to be the other person changes, or the managers have got to take my side. And that's an incredibly precarious and frightening and stressful situation to be in, because we're placing all of our expectation in other people's hands. And of course, they may not agree. And certainly the person accused of bullying isn't going to agree, or not certainly, but they may not. And it's very unlikely they're going to agree with our suggestion that they need to change. So one of the significant features of both bullying and conflict coaching would be that if say I'm working with someone with conflict coaching, or in the initial meeting that I might have with someone over a workplace relationship breakdown where there's allegations of bullying within it, the first question I would ask is, if someone says to me, my boss is a bully, I would say, so what is it they do that leads you to say they're a bully? Because given that there are so many features of behaviours that people might see as bullying, just describing someone as a bully just it's almost a meaningless phrase, because it's not clear what the actual behaviours are. So some people might say, well, they swear at me. Okay, well, that's one thing that might be bullying. Other people say they stand behind me, kind of pointing out things I'm doing wrong over my shoulder, and I find it intimidating or embarrassing or whatever. So that's a different thing. So or it might be, they send emails and they criticise me in the email and it's shared to everyone. So that's another thing. So there are countless different things that people might perceive as being bullying. But until there's an understanding of what the specifics are, it's unclear what can actually change. So what can then be done is for people to look at and discuss, well, they swear at me, or they stand behind me, or whatever, because then the journey can start of exploring, so what can be done differently? What would you like what would you like them to do differently? What communication have you had about that? What is it about them doing that that you find upsetting? I'm not saying there's any reason why they shouldn't, but what I mean is for them to personally say what they find upsetting about it, because people will interpret and experience and feel differently about different behaviours. So, because then what can be looked at is what can be done about that specific behaviour. So I want to point out the significant difference between the two approaches. One is looking at what the behaviour is that's upsetting and what might be possible either to improve that or to support ourselves if that behaviour were to continue. Because if I simply expect the other person to change, that might not happen. But I can look at what I can do to support myself if it does continue. Additionally, if I feel comfortable doing so, I might communicate with the person about that particular behaviour, which is a very different thing to simply accusing them of being a bully, because one is likely to one opens up the possibility of a discussion about it. The other one is simply kind of jabbing the person with an accusation. So hopefully you can see the first option is going to be much more possibly going to lead to a useful outcome than the second one. But similarly for the person accused, they don't need to or have to respond simply by being defensive and kind of making counter allegations, which is a very common thing. They can explore with the other person what it is that's happened that means their relationship isn't working, with the view to improving their working interaction. It may not be that they become friends, but they can look to improve their interaction. They may not feel comfortable or be allowed to communicate with that person, so they can also look at, well, given there's this suggestion that you're or accusation of you being a bully, what can you do to support yourself in the situation? Because bear in mind, the accusation doesn't mean guilt. And this is one of the other many problems with the prove and punish approach, is that quite often someone being accused of being a bully is often treated as guilty until proven innocent, rather than the more just way of dealing things, even though it doesn't work, of someone being accused but only being deemed guilty once it's proven. But as I say, the likelihood of the proof happening anyway, whatever their behaviours, is unlikely. But the point about these interactions I'm talking about, which is different to the prove and punish, is it's always looking at what can I do, what do I have power over to support myself, what do I do and what do I have power over to try to improve the situation with the other person. Whereas the prove and punish approach is dependent upon others rather than any power that we take for ourselves to improve the situation. Now, again, some people may say, oh, yeah, it's all very nicey, but they're horrible people, etc. All I can say to you is I have seen very deeply held, difficult, resentful relationships be resolved through this approach. And I can absolutely say it's a more effective approach than the prove and punish approach, which is traditionally and standardly the approach taken by almost all organisations in relation to allegations of bullying. It's either prove there is bullying or people are expected to shut up. Whereas with this, there's no attempt to prove bullying. It's about always looking at things that can improve. So even if, so it becomes irrelevant whether there's a proof of bullying or not. It's always looking to improve the situation between people, either just for the individual, if there's no possibility of interacting with the other person, or together if there is that possibility. And by the individual, I mean either the person making the accusation or the allegation and the person who's accused. So it works from both sides. It's supportive of both sides. But the point about it is the power is available to each individual to make their own changes and make their own movements towards resolution, rather than simply handing it over to somebody else to prove that they're right or wrong. and expecting the other person to change without any engagement with them about what it is they actually want them to change. And again, people may say there, well, I want them to stop bullying me. It's like, but what do you mean by bullying? What do they understand the behaviours to be that you're concerned about if the only description has been bullying? Or even if it's you said, well, they're rude to me, or if you're not able to actually work with the actual specifics of what the issue is, it becomes this kind of ambiguous concept of bullying without looking at the practical realities of what's actually happening in the relationship. So as I say, some people may respond to this and say, no, it's all pie in the sky. And if you do say that, all I would say is, well, you consider how effective the other approach has been for you. If you can genuinely say it's worked, then fine. And by genuinely say it's worked, I mean genuinely it has worked for you, not it would have done if the bully had changed, if or the person you've alleged to be a bully had changed, or if the investigators had done their job properly. Because I can guarantee you there's nothing they can do using the prove and punish approach which would ever lead to the outcome that you're wanting. So it's a question of whether you continue to want that to be the approach you take, even though it's, as I say, in my experience, never led to a useful outcome, or whether you're open to acknowledging that there could be other ways of dealing with things, which also place a lot of power with you, rather than for you to passively hand things over, and the expectation be that you passively hand things over to others to do things, or others to change for you when you've accused them of bullying. You know, what would you expect the likely response to be if you accuse someone of bullying? To simply change or to defend against it? And similarly, for the person who's accused of bullying, what would you expect to be the outcome if you're expecting them to simply stop their allegation? You know, what can you do to try to improve the situation rather than simply and only adopt a defensive approach? And then obviously, thirdly, there's the people who are trying to operate a process which, if they've ever done it before, they probably know isn't going to lead to anything, and it will simply default to people being separated, and then the likelihood is that that will then go to a legal process outside of the workplace, usually based on constructive dismissal, and as a consequence, there not be any kind of effective outcome. And then also consider what that means for the environment left behind. That people live in fear of allegations of bullying rather than say, what can we learn from this? What can we learn about how we're interacting with each other? What can we learn from the fact that if we don't take an adversarial approach, there's an opportunity for us to look at how we're interacting in the workplace together. I'm going to leave it there, because this has either carried you with it or you've rejected it much earlier on. But all I would say is look at the prevalence of allegations of bullying and how rarely, if ever, there's a satisfactory outcome. And to look at, is it adopting the prove and punish approach, or has it actually looked at what individuals can do to try to resolve and repair and improve that working situation, without an expectation that it's going to go to court? Because it never will go to court, because it's bullying. It's not legally defined. Despite many media portrayals you might have, it's never actually about bullying. It's always going to be about constructive dismissal or other issues. So there we have it. It's much more kind of amplified upon in the book, if that's of interest to you. It's only about £6 or £7, so if it's of interest to you, please purchase it. And thanks for listening so far. And if you are experiencing these kinds of difficulties, I very much wish you the best in proceeding, and I hope you have a satisfactory outcome. Thanks for listening. Have a good day. Bye-bye.